The bridge to the future, the journey continues. And now ZNS Radio and Television Network takes you live to Mount Carey Union Baptist Church, located in Fox Hill, for a lecture on the history, development, and impact of Fox Hill on the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Presented by the Honourable Fred Mitchell, Member of Parliament for Fox Hill and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration.
"179 years ago, the bells of freedom rang out for black slaves in the Bahamas. And tonight, we pay homage to those who came before us, especially during this, our 40th anniversary of independence. Good evening, I'm Julian Reed, and we're here at Mount Carey Union Baptist Church, one of 4 historic churches in the Fox Hill area. Now, we bring to you tonight a special lecture by the Member of Parliament for the area, the Honourable Fred Mitchell, who's also Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration. It is on the history, development, and impact of Fox Hill on the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And now we take you to the podium and our Mistress of Ceremony tonight, Mrs. Tammy Ferguson-Culmer.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you please stand for the singing of our national anthem, which will be done by Mr. Alfred Culmer, and remain standing for the invocation, which will be done by Reverend Warren Anderson.
Lift up your head to the rising sun, Bahamaland. March on to glory, your bright banner waving high. See how the world marks the manner of your bearing, pledged to excel through love and unity, pressing onward, march together to a common loftier goal. Steady sunward, though the weather hide the wide and treacherous shore. Lift up your head to the rising sun, Bahamaland, till the road you trod lead unto your God. March on, Bahamaland.
Let us bow as we look to God in prayer. God our Father, we thank you for this day that you've given to us. We thank you for your love, your mercy, and your grace. We thank you now that we've come in a setting such as this to learn more about the workings and the history of this Fox Hill constituency. We pray for our minister who comes today to bring our lecture to us. We ask you to bless him as he speaks to us. Be with all those who would hear. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen.
You may be seated. Tonight, it is with great pleasure I stand before you as a Foxhillian who was nurtured from the soil, watered and blossomed in the great and historical community of Fox Hill. I am proud to be a Foxhillian. We have gathered here tonight to be educated, taught, and enlightened on the history of Fox Hill. Fox Hill is a village that will always be embedded in the history books of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. As a village where its people was truly emancipated from slavery. So with this brief introduction, let us attentively allow our minds to be absorbed by the research and presentation by our Member of Parliament and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration, the Honourable Frederick A. Mitchell. Coming now to make you all feel welcome is Ms. Olive Mackey.
It's just a great pleasure to have each and every one of you here this evening. I extend a warm welcome to our Prime Minister, the Honourable Perry Christie, our Deputy Prime Minister, Honourable Brave Davis, our Minister for Tourism, Honourable Obi Wijcombe, and our great Member of Parliament for Fox Hill. And leading the crew of Independence Celebration Committee, Mr. Jack Thompson. And on that note, I welcome each and every one of you to this historic edifice in Fox Hill. You are always free to be in our midst at Mount Carey Union Baptist Church, where our pastor is none other but the Reverend Warren Anderson, our pastor emeritus, the Reverend Dr. Enoch Batford, and all the great people of Mount Carey, all the great people of Fox Hill. I say, you are truly welcome. Just enjoy and take in every bit of this history that Fox Hill has to offer. You are indeed welcome.
Yes. Now that you've all been welcomed, we're now going to call on Mr. Theo Mars, who will do the introduction of our presenter. Give him a hand as he comes.
Pleasant good night, everyone. It is my pleasure this evening to present to you Frederick A. Mitchell, MP for Fox Hill and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration. Fred Mitchell, christened Frederick Audley Mitchell, is a citizen of the Bahamas, born in Nassau on the 5th of October, 1953. The son of Frederick Mitchell Sr. and Leela Mitchell, both now deceased, of Collins Avenue, Nassau. He has been active in the public life of the country since he joined the PLP in 1975. He has worked as a journalist and is a lawyer by profession. Prior to his appointment and election to office, he was an activist in the human rights movement in the Bahamas with special interests in the judiciary and South Africa. He served the Senate of the Bahamas from 1992 to 2002 and is now a member of the House of Assembly in the Bahamas. He was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Public Service in 2002 and served until 2007. The portfolio was later expanded in February 2006 to include foreign trade. He is a graduate of Antioch College, Yellow Springs, Ohio, the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the University of Buckingham, United Kingdom. He served as the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Culture. He is serving his third term as MP of Fox Hill, having been first elected in 2002. He is in his second stint as Minister of Foreign Affairs and is now also the Minister of Immigration. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming to the podium the Honourable Fred Mitchell, MP for Fox Hill.
Good evening, Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, my colleague, the Minister of Tourism, the Ambassador to CARICOM, Mr. Andre Rollins, the Member of Parliament for Fort Charlotte, and to all you other good ladies and gentlemen, including the head of the Independence Secretariat, or the Executive Secretary of the Independence Secretariat, Mr. Jack Thompson, and to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, particularly the brothers and sisters of the Fox Hill constituency. Let me add my words of welcome to all of you this evening on this special occasion. I wish to thank, first of all, the pastor of the Mount Carey Baptist Church, the Reverend Warren Anderson, the head of the oldest Baptist congregation in what we today call the village of Fox Hill. He is the 14th in a line of pastors for this church dating back to 1842, and he was elected pastor just this year. And so congratulations to you, sir, and thank you for I want to also pay tribute before I start at this time. Mr. Maurice Tynes, who is the chair of the Fox Hill Festival Committee, lost his mother overnight. She died at the age of 94 years of age, as the late Sir Lyndon would say, a good innings. And so tonight we honor him. We also share our condolences on behalf of the community with him and say to him that we will pray for you and lend whatever support we can for the great contribution which Mrs. Tynes made to this community in particular and to the wider Bahamian community. And I'm pleased to say I was looking at some old photographs that on the 10th of December 2006, the Fox Hill community honored Mrs. Tynes, as they do every year, by naming the Christmas tree, which is lit on the Fox Hill Parade in her honor. And there's a beautiful picture of her standing in front of the Christmas tree on the 10th of December 2006. And so we mourn her passing. Well, now, let me state the obvious. I am not a Fox Hillian by birth. And I would like to believe, however, that in this, my 11th year as the Member of Parliament, and my 16th year as a candidate for this area, that I can qualify as a Fox Hillian by adoption. Be that as it may, it is an area which is special to me, not just because of my professional connection, but also because as a committed Africanist, it looms large in my imagination as one of the last repositories of the African culture established in our country, where the slaves were brought from Africa those many centuries ago. We who govern the nation today are the beneficiaries of the work done by those slaves and former slaves, transplanted against their will from the West and Central Africa to these islands. We must never forget them. Now gone on, many names we will never find in the history books. This then, tonight, is dedicated to them and indeed all men and women of goodwill who fought and continue to fight for the dignity of the African in this land and for all people. This lecture was commissioned by the Right Honourable Prime Minister. Both he and I hail from the Valley, which is some distance away from here. But ever since I became a candidate in this area, he has come to Fox Hill every year to join in the Fox Hill Day celebrations. Fox Hill Day is celebrated on the second Tuesday in August. Before the year that he first came in 1998, he had never been to one of the Fox Hill Day celebrations before, and when he came, was fascinated by the traditions. In terms of the public policy, one of the observations that he made was the fact that if we were not careful to nurture these traditions, they would soon die out. It was important, he said, to teach the young people and to keep them engaged in the traditions of the village culture. I had been speaking to him over the years of his coming here about us trying to settle a narrative which would be the definitive history of Fox Hill. This would be something that every student in the primary school, the Sandilands Primary School, would learn in a short, pithy statement which summed up the history of their village. I reached out to my political opponent at the time, Senator Jacinta Higgs, and asked her if we could work together to try and settle this narrative. She is unable to be here tonight because she's on leave, but she has embraced the project and has been working on a book to tell the story of Fox Hill. And she's asked me to apologize for her absence tonight, and I look forward to its content. The Prime Minister, as a result of our conversations, challenged me last year from his address on the podiums in the various churches in Fox Hill to give a lecture on the history of Fox Hill this year for the people of the Bahamas. This would be particularly important since this year is the 40th anniversary of the independence of our country. So this challenge is being met today by this lecture. I break no new ground here. The sources are many, including notes from the social history of Fox Hill. And I'm simply in this exercise summarizing what the sources have said in the hope that this becomes a narrative for the younger generation to adopt. I believe that a people who know who they are and where they have come from are a stronger and more resilient people. And I want the little children of Sandilands Primary School to know that they have a goodly heritage. In the words of the Bible, they are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. As trite as this may seem, we must reinforce this message at every point to our little ones. In the words of the Reverend Jesse Jackson, they are somebody. So, my thanks at the start to the Prime Minister and to the government gathered here today generally for supporting this night and for all of our efforts here in supporting all of our efforts here in Fox Hill. I also want to tell the story of my association with Fox Hill. My father, Frederick Audley Mitchell Sr., was a Baintown man, born in 1919, and a contemporary of the late Dr. Cleveland Eneas, also of Baintown, and christened in St. Agnes Church. My mother was born in Augusta Street, and though she later moved to the land appointed to her mother, formerly a Hannah, in the White Grounds, she was christened at St. Agnes Church in February of 1923, 3 months after her birth, when she was born on Christmas Eve, 1922. The point of this is that Africanism is in me and it comes naturally. Both my parents were born in Baintown, which is one of the centers of African culture, and more particularly, as described by Dr. Cleveland Eneas, Yoruba culture in the Bahamas. Both bore the legends Africans to describe their race on their birth certificates, as did mine when I came along in 1953. So, it would be no surprise then, and in retrospect, that my childhood memories are replete with the excitement of my mother packing us all together, my brother Ian and I, to come to Fox Hill on Fox Hill Day for the programs of the churches, the food, the ganeps, and the freedom which we had as children to simply run up and down and do anything we wanted and eat anything we wanted. On that day, adults were very permissive with us children. When, therefore, on that fateful day in 1996, the late George Mackey, the former MP for this area, walked into my office to ask me if I would mind if he recommended my name to the late Sir Lyndon O. Pinling to be a candidate for this area, it was in many respects befitting the expression from Shakespeare, "Oh, my prophetic soul." His parting words were that if I got the nomination, and if I were successful as the representative, my job was to protect and enhance the people of Fox Hill, their history and their traditions. I embraced that mission, and that is why in the month of August, so much of the energy and resources of the state are put into ensuring that the festival is successful. The history books say that the Fox Hill Festival began as a celebration of Emancipation Day somewhere around 1857. By 1870 or so, the celebrations on the 1st of August had morphed into Fox Hill Day, with completely separate celebrations from Emancipation Day itself. In a minute, I will go to the primary sources and quote extensively from them, but first, I would wish to record the history of how Fox Hill came to be Fox Hill. Here is what the archives records, and I'm quoting. The village was named after one Samuel Fox, who owned a piece of property in the Eastern District of New Providence. His estate, a total of some 23.5 acres, was said to be on the present site of St. Augustine's Monastery and was granted in 1801. Records show that the village of Fox Hill existed before 1850. They also show that Robert Sandilands in 1849 laid out and sold allotments in the general area commonly known and designated by the name of Fox Hill. In addition to Sandilands Village, the Fox Hill area includes the inhabitants of the Creek Village, which was located on the northeastern coast of New Providence. It was closely linked to Fox Hill. During the 1930s, the inhabitants of the Creek Village sold their land and moved to Sandilands Village. Other villages in Fox Hill are Congo and Nango towns, Joshua and Burnside towns. It is believed that Congo and Nango towns were named after resident Africans who belonged to either the Congo or Nango tribe. Joshua Town is situated south of Nango Town, and Burnside Town no longer exists." End of quote. Gladys Manuel, a Foxhillian who was formerly a Brown, wrote the following, and I quote, "Fox Hill was a settlement in existence before Sandilands Village. Mr. Robert Sandilands, the English landowner after whom the village was named, only arrived in the colony of the Bahama Islands to serve as a justice of the General Court in the 1820s, and did not begin his development of Sandilands Village until 1890. On the other hand, Mr. Samuel Fox was a freed slave. He came to the colony during the pre-emancipation period. Fox was officially granted 23.5 acres of land in 1801, and the community in the vicinity of his estate became known as Fox Hill. It appears that the first residents of the Fox Hill settlement were, like Samuel Fox, also freed African slaves, whereas those who were to populate Sandilands Village, along with Robert Sandilands and under his auspices, were country-born, or persons in the colony of African descent. And on the 1950 map, Sandilands Village is marked as east of James Jarrett's land. Creek Village, she says, began in 1750, when missionaries from the Church of England, calling the village New Guinea, traveled there from Christ Church in Nassau Town to hold religious services in the houses of the native residents. Robert Sandilands, who donated the burial grounds, now called Freedom Park, in the village to that church, to the Anglican Church, 1 year prior to the move from the Creek to Sandilands Village. The move to Sandilands Village gained new momentum due to a past severe hurricanes which had devastated the north coast of New Providence. Agricultural development was guided and encouraged by Robert Sandilands. Mr. Sandilands described Fox Hill as a firm body of industrious and contented people upon whose labor one can always depend for wages of 1 shilling per day. The Department of Archives wrote this in 1987. During, and I quote again, "During the 1820s and 1830s, a number of liberated African settlements outside the city of Nassau were established. This action had become necessary because the white inhabitants resented the presence of these freed blacks in the colony. Each African or black settlement in New Providence celebrated their own individual festival on the 1st of August with church services and parades. However, as far back as the 1870s, Fox Hill Day celebrations were held on the second Tuesday in August. It was a time of revelry when the people of Fox Hill, Grantstown, and Baintown enjoyed themselves." Here is what the Nassau Guardian wrote on the 13th of August, 1890. So the Nassau Guardian is writing this the 13th of August, 1890. "Fox Hill Day holiday was observed yesterday by a crowd of persons who assembled at that village from several districts. They had a very bright day for their pleasure, and for a wonder escaped the rain, which as a rule gives some people a drenching before they can reach home on such occasions. Carriages were plying along the streets throughout the day and afternoon, conveying passengers to and from Sandilands. The annual gatherings of the Sunday schools in connection with the Baptist churches, St. Mark's, St. Paul's, and Zion is Mount Carey, took place from which great pleasure was derived by those who were present. The only casualty we know of was the death of a horse owned by Mr. George Armbruster, which had made several trips up and down with a carriage." End of quote. Dr. Gail Saunders, writing in Historic Bahamas, said the following: "Some think that Fox Hill and Sandilands Village are one and the same. However, Justice Robert Sandilands, a judge in the General Supreme Court, arrived in New Providence in the 1820s, and also resided in the eastern area of Fox Hill. He laid out a small village in the area in the 1830s and 1840s. Dividing up the land, he sold lots at 6 shillings each and provided mortgages. And the researcher says that 6 shillings translates into about $14 today. So the original lots in Sandilands were sold at $14 apiece. The purchasers of the land could pay in kind, as cash in those days was a scarce commodity. He also set apart certain other parts of the village, public areas such as roads, a burial ground, now known as Freedom Park, a marketplace, and a school lot. And according to the Nassau Guardian article, the 12th of May, 1849, Governor John Gregory complimented Judge Sandilands by formally changing the name of Fox Hill to Sandilands Village. Fox Hill predates Sandilands Village, and the area is still referred to as Fox Hill. Judge Sandilands, at his own expense, opened up a private thoroughfare from his own land to the Eastern Road in the mid-1800s, which led through the Creek settlement and connected to Village Road. By 1888, 600 inhabitants resided in the area. Dr. Gail Saunders writes in her book, Slavery in the Bahamas, and I quote, "The arrival of liberated Africans had a profound effect on the growth of the population of the Bahamas between 1808 and 1840. The most notable increase of the population during that period was amongst the free black population, and this increase was due mainly to the landing and settlement of liberated Africans in the Bahamas. Liberated Africans were originally slaves on their way to be sold to some plantation owner in the Caribbean or America. With the British abolition of the slave trade in March 1807, slaves were taken as a prize of war or seized as forfeitures to become the property of the government. On being landed in the Bahamas, they were placed in the hands of the customs officer, whose duty it was to bind them to suitable masters or mistresses in order for them to learn a trade or handicraft for periods not exceeding 14 years. New Providence got the majority of liberated Africans. However, many of the freed blacks lived in several densely populated areas rather than being evenly spread over the island. This was probably due to the fear whites had of having too many blacks in or near the town of Nassau. In the 1830s, there were at least 8 free black villages or settlements outside the town of Nassau. They were Grantstown and Baintown, just south of the city, Carmichael and Adelaide in the southwest, Delancey Town, just west of Nassau, Gambier in the west, Creek Village, or New Guinea, and Fox Hill in the east." End of quote. Dr. Cleveland Eneas, writing in his book, Baintown, said the following: "Most of these celebrations culminated in the biggest event of the year that took place between two peoples, the Baintown and the Fox Hill peoples, and that was Fox Hill Day. This usually started off with a celebration of Emancipation Day, which was observed on the 1st of August if it didn't fall on a Sunday. In my memory, the observance of Emancipation Day only took place in Fox Hill, and it was celebrated chiefly by the Yoruba people. There were Thanksgiving services in the churches, and then there was a gathering on the parade for the making of speeches and general merrymaking. This was only a warm-up rehearsal for Fox Hill Day, which took place a few days later. Baintown and Fox Hill started preparing for Fox Hill Day way down in June, and Baintown people started moving to Fox Hill, especially those who had relatives there and somewhere to stay in Fox Hill. About a week before the event, Baintowners moved to Fox Hill. The straw work had to be made and prepared for sale to the visitors. New dresses had to be sewn, and costumes of many kinds had to be prepared. Most of the preparations centered around programs that had to be held and pieces that had to be learned. These programs represented something of a competition and were taken in earnest. Each church and Sunday school of the village staged a program which took place on the morning of Fox Hill Day. There was much oratory, many recitations, dialogue, and music. Occasionally there was some drama thrown in, and they were all great productions as far as Fox Hill went. Children who were descended from Fox Hill and lived in Baintown were prepared and took part in these events. After midday, the revelry took place on the parade ground, and this was revelry. In the center of the parade ground, there was the pole to be plaited to the Goombay rhythms of the day. All around the periphery of the park were ring plays going on. The songs that were sung during the ring plays were the real folk songs of my people, some of which had been put to music by modern players and sung commercially by our modern balladeers. We sang songs such as Do a Nanny, or My Mother Told Me 3 years ago, I Mustn't Marry No Lazy Man, and numerous other rhythmic tunes that kept the ring play lively. There were stalls set up all around the parade like a bazaar, with all manner of goodies to be had for a small price. There were stalls selling akra, moi moi, agidi. There were almond cakes, coconut cakes, benny cakes, conch salad, and conch fritters. There were all manner of fruits, mangoes, gannets, tamarinds, sapodillas, coconuts. Food galore to whet the appetite of any Yoruba gourmet. Nearby and in plentiful supply were liquors of all kinds, but mostly rum and gin. And since there were few teetotalers in the crowd, these stalls did a moving business. Much merriment prevailed in the whole area, and there were no sad souls around. The workers of Nassau were making merry in Fox Hill, and they may as well have declared a holiday, because it virtually was. Okay then, so that's his remembrance. Let's now skip 100 years plus from the original celebrations of Fox Hill Day, when the Associated Press wrote this in 1937. The thump of goatskin drums and the wail of bottle and comb music roused the usually drowsy Fox Hill parade this morning, for today was Emancipation Day, and all the Bahamas celebrated. The parade, a sunny green shaded by two enormous silk cotton trees at either end, was the scene of day-long festivities by which the predominant Negro populace commemorated with singing and dancing their freedom from slavery in 1834. All business in the capital was suspended, and most of the white folks, too, journeyed out to Fox Hill, a picturesque native settlement 10 miles from the town. On all the out islands that form the British colony, similar celebrations were also held. Fox Hill Day is an old institution here, but when the centennial of freedom occurred in 1934, the festivities were unparalleled. The light-hearted Negroes cast about for some occasion to renew the merrymaking on a large scale, when it was recalled that although the British Emancipation Act was passed in 1834, the slaves were placed on 3 years probation and did not receive their freedom until 1837. So this year, another centennial was celebrated today. The program on the parade included the crowning of the King and Queen for the year. No beauty contest was this, but a recognition of the most respected elders. The Fox Hill settlement virtually governs itself. It is composed of Negroes only a generation removed from Africa. The people subsist by primitive industries. The women raise farm produce and walk the 10 miles to Nassau carrying their vegetables on their head to the marketplace. Others weave hats and baskets from coconut palm straw to sell to tourists, and the men fish for sponges. But work was forgotten today. There was music on the Fox Hill Parade. End of quote. I'd like now to turn to the institutions that created, nurtured, supported, and shaped Fox Hill into what it is today. I would say the principal amongst these are the churches and the schools. The schools, of course, are the St. Helens Primary School, St. Anselm's Day School, St. Anne's Anglican School, and St. Augustine's College. These schools have been joined by L.W. Young Junior High, which was once a senior and a junior high, and the Dame Doris Johnson Senior High. In addition, many of the churches in the area have day schools, like Macedonia, St. Mark's, and at one time Mount Carey. And all of these schools and churches have helped to shape what Fox Hill is today. I want to begin with St. Anselm's, which in the scheme of things is a relative newcomer to this area. But I begin with them because there is a record of conditions in Fox Hill recorded by the nuns who came up to teach in Fox Hill, which I think you will find instructive. Now, the Church of St. Anselm's was established by Father Bonaventure Hansen, a Benedictine monk, on the 29th of August, 1933. Sisters of Charity from Mount St. Vincent in New York in the United States, Sister Marita Ann Fox and Sister Veronica Mary Ann McGann, were assigned to establish the St. Anselm's all-age school as part of the Catholic system. There is an extract from one of their letters which was published in Upon These Rocks by Coleman Barry, a history of the Catholic Church in the Bahamas, and is quoted in a booklet from the history of St. Anselm's. So these are the nuns now writing about their arrival. And I quote, "We arrived August 28, 1933. The following day, we went to Fox Hill, where we were heartily welcomed by Father Bonaventure Hansen, the catechist, James Roberts, and a group of future pupils and prospective Catholics. Father Bonaventure announced at Sunday Mass that school would open on Monday and that the boys and girls of all ages were welcome. We sisters arrived on Monday, equipped with paper, pencils, and lunch. An iron wheel was struck with a hammer upon our arrival. Our registration consisted of us trying to get names, first only. Example, Mispa, Gladstone, Livingston. When we asked for the last name, there was no response. We found out later that they used the term title for surname. We tried to find out where they lived, and we were told, down so by the big cotton tree, or up so by the sapodilla tree. The children, aged from 4 to 16, we first grouped according to age, later according to ability. The older ones I took into the rented hall. For several days, Sister Marita Ann taught the younger ones under the big cotton tree. After about 2 weeks, Father Bonaventure hired a room in an empty house called the Annex. Father arranged to have movable pieces of wood added to the backs of the benches in the old hall, which we used as desks. One of the first things we got started was a sewing class after school, so that the children could be properly clothed. Our friends in New York supplied us with blue denim for the boys' pants and plaid material for the girls. This class drew a large gathering of women." End of quote. Now, I should say parenthetically that the first baby to be christened from the village as a Roman Catholic was the late Benjamin Demerit, whose son, the now Father Reginald Demerit, is a Catholic priest and serves the church now in Exuma. Many of the leaders of the Fox Hill community, though, also came from the church, and foremost amongst them, I would suggest, are of course today Monsignor Preston Moss, as did 3 of the leaders of the Fox Hill Festival Committee in its modern incarnation, the late Eric Wilmot, William Ramming, and Charles Johnson, all of whom were members of St. Anselm's, all of whom are now deceased. Dr. Gail Saunders writes that sometime around 1740 or so, the Anglican priests started coming to New Guinea to service the people at services in what was then called St. Anne's Chapel. But what is said is that Mount Carey is the oldest of the Baptist churches. And here is how Mount Carey records the history of the church in which we sit, as set down by the Reverend Randolph Armbruster. Again, I quote, "History recalls that a village east of New Providence, made upon the free Negroes and mulattoes, was formed and called the Creek. On January 29th, in the year of our Lord, 1833, Joseph Burton arrived in the Bahamas as the first missionary from the Baptist Missionary Society of London, England, and started a preaching station at the Creek, and the mission station flourished. South of the Creek, a new settlement was formed by Africans known as Yorubas, Nangos, Congos. They were brought into New Providence by slave ships, and the village was named Fox Hill. In 1840, another missionary came from the Baptist Missionary Society in London to help Burton. His name was the Reverend Henry Capron. He visited the village and ministered to their needs and asked them if they wanted a Baptist chapel built in the village. They agreed. The people started meeting in the open air on this land that we're standing on in the bush. A Sabbath school was started, and 32 persons were baptized in the name of the Lord. They then started a building with limestone and timber from the pine barrens. 30 persons worked the first day, and 21 persons worked the following day. After the remaining 4 days of work, Reverend Capron paid them their wages. The chapel was then completed with a thatched roof, and they named it Zion. Its doors were opened for divine worship on Sunday, the 28th of April, 1843. Then, 23 people were baptized in the name of the Lord. Reverend Martin was its first pastor. The church progressed, and its membership increased immensely. End of quote from the history of Mount Carey. We saw how the British put down slaves taken from shippers on the high seas in the Fox Hill area. These ships were violating the British ban on the slave trade, which had been abolished in 1807. The slaves set down were not from West Africa, but it appears came from the Congo, and so a new dimension to African life in the colony was introduced. Here is how that fact found its way into the life of the village, as recorded in the history of St. Paul's Baptist Church, as recorded in some notes called A Brief History of St. Paul's Baptist Church. And I quote, "It all began in the quaint community of Fox Hill, when, in the 19th century, Pastor J.A. Noblin was the pastor of Mount Carey Baptist Church, Fox Hill. This church has undergone many structural changes and was a place of worship for many Fox Hillian families. Mount Carey was called Zion Chapel, and so were all the other churches that were connected to Zion, no matter what their names were. One of those churches was Bethel Chapel, who worshipped with Mount Carey, then known as Zion Chapel. Well, in the year 1869, a dispute arose between the Reverend John Davy, who had been a missionary in the Bahamas since 1856, and Bethel Chapel. This dispute resulted in Zion and Bethel taking different paths and causing a division among the congregation at Mount Carey Baptist Church. Those who left Mount Carey organized St. Paul's Baptist Church in 1870 and became a branch of Bethel. The split between the churches is said to have been caused by trouble between the Congos and the Yorubas. The Congos were said to be the last shipment of captured slaves brought to New Providence on the 28th of July, 1860. They settled in Congo Town, Fox Hill, but were said to be taking too long to learn to speak English. The Yorubas stayed in Mount Carey, and many of the Congos went to St. Paul's, so the tradition says. End of quote from the history of St. Paul's. So, there was this social divide between Congos and Yorubas, so tradition says. And of course, the Reverend Philip Ramming, a former pastor of Mount Carey, says he remembers his mother saying to him as a boy, "Don't go running after those Congos and their fire dance." Today, of course, while there is some reference to those ethnic and social divisions, the community has now come together under the now direction, for example, of Trevor Pratt and Warren Davis, who lead the Junkanoo group formed in 1986 called first the Fox Hill Congos, and then in 2003 they recreated the group and they call it the Original Congos. So the name Congos seems to have survived in the lore of the village, often with basketball teams being named after the old tribal settlers. And interestingly enough, Nicolette Bethel writes that the arrival of the Congos to the Bahamas in the 19th century actually changed the nature of Junkanoo, fundamentally from the snare drum supplying the rhythm to the Congo drum that we recognize today being beaten by the lone drummer who carries the underlying beat. There are, of course, other churches in the village. St. Mark's at Roma Street, whose pastor is the Reverend Carrington Pinder. Macedonia, which grew out of St. Mark's congregation, whose pastor is Reverend Hartman Nixon. The two Methodist churches, both called Coke, headed by Reverend Emily Demerit and Reverend Bethel. The Church of God of Prophecy at Roma Street. And I know the Fergusons told me the name of the pastor. She's Pastor Johnson, who heads the church in Roma Street. And the Church of God, which began originally, I think, at Abner Street and then moved to Coburn Street, now headed by the Reverend Julia Bain, who is a Fox Hillian, and the Church of God Faith Mission, which is headed by the Reverend Sherelle Saunders, who is the granddaughter of one of the matriarchs of the old Fox Hill, the late Elma Viola Johnson. I've mentioned the two congregations headed by female Foxhillians, because I wish to come back to the role of female leadership in Fox Hill later in this presentation. St. Paul's, in its brief history of St. Paul's, lists the following names as part of its congregation and heritage, and you would recognize them: Burnsides, Sweetings, Dorsets, Rammings, Fergusons, Rokers, Williamsons. The familiar names connected with Fox Hill, I'm sure you recognize them all, but I dare say you all know other names like Demerit and Davis and Mackey and Edgecombe and Ramsey and Armbruster as being inextricably linked to Fox Hill. One interesting fact of how these names came to Fox Hill is found in the history of now Commissioner Thomas Dorset of Winter Park, a city in Florida. He was born originally in Exuma, and in his history of his family, he records the following in the Dorset's Roots, dated the 31st of December, 1982, and I quote. He says, "Almost 200 years ago, a little boy, 8 years old, was forcibly taken from a village in Sierra Leone in West Africa and was taken aboard a slave ship bound for the West Indies and South America. This was just a short time after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire." I think he means of the slave trade. "This ship was a Spanish registration, and as she passed through the Bahamas, a British colony, the ship was intercepted by a British warship, and the human cargo slaves were set free near an island known as Cotton Key. These slaves, now free, were taken to Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas, and were landed at the Vando Wharf. This wharf was then used to be called the Slave Exchange. And as the cargo of pitiful human slaves landed, a crowd of sympathetic men and women became interested in the adoption of these slaves, now free. An Englishman by the name of Dorset, whose plantation was located in Fox Hill, adopted this 8-year-old boy and gave him the name Thomas Dorset." And that's the end of that quote. No exposition, of course, on the role of the church in the history of this area would be complete without some reference to St. Anne's Church, and in particular St. Anne's School, and the role of Reverend Canon David Pugh. Here is what Canon Pugh in the Bahamas Handbook said in 1995, written by Debbie Nash, and I quote, "But perhaps the greatest living history of Fox Hill is to be found at St. Anne's Parish, which dates from 1740. Its longest officiating priest was Father David John Pugh, who was an RAF pilot stationed in the Bahamas during World War II. When the war ended, he returned to the island to be ordained and became rector of St. Anne's in 1954. Before him, there had been 13 priests over a 3-year period. He would be rector there for 41 years. In May 1995, St. Anne's School celebrated its 40th anniversary. The school was started by Father Pugh in a little garage at the back of the church rectory. Back then, just 6 children attended, all of whom grew up to have secure top positions in the society. With this school, Father Pugh enabled the poor children of Fox Hill to have access to high school education. Of course, the Bahamas Handbook story did not go on to record that many of the children in Fox Hill who he formally adopted and who actually took on his last name. You can see then from what I've said here today that the church in this area was intimately involved in education. St. Anselm's, St. Anne's, and almost every church has a day school for children. History records the arrival of the St. Augustine's Monastery, said to be the site of the original grant to Samuel Fox, after whom the area is named. Many of the boys in the village went to St. Augustine's, run by the monks. Up until 1997, the land to the east of the monastery was owned by the monks, and it was an area of broadleaf coppice, which was a playground for local boys and girls. Today, all of that is gone with the sale of the land by the church, and the bush, which once existed, has been replaced by the subdivisions Canon Pugh, Smithsville, Freddie Munnings Manor, and Rita Pugh, the development of which began in and around 2002. Most children, however, who live in the Fox Hill area and grew up in Fox Hill at one time or another pass through the Sandilands Primary School, which began its existence over 100 years ago on a lot which shows up as early as 1850 on lots of land laid out by Judge Robert Sandlands, after whom the school is now named. There is another view, of course, about how that lot came to be, and that view is that the land was originally set aside for the school in 1787 on land granted to a loyalist named Lewis Johnston. At the same time as the school, though, was gifted by Robert Sandlands for the public purpose of education, there was also the gift of a public lot for the burial ground. That burial ground is today Freedom Park, which was dedicated on the 27th of December 1967 by the then representative for the Winton constituency, of which Fox Hill was a part, the late Carlton Elisha Francis. The school's history claims, as amongst its former pupils, MPs George Mackey and Frank Edgecombe, the Reverends Carl and Philip Ramming, Magistrate Linda Virgil, Julian Francis, the former Central Bank governor, Mary Johnson, a former director of nursing, amongst its former teachers, Dame Doris Johnson, and former MPs Frank Edgecombe and Carlton Francis. In fact, the late George Mackey makes the point in the article in the Bahamas Handbook that education was the key for the people of Fox Hill. He himself was proud of his association with the Sandlands School up to his death. He told the handbook, and he told me, that when he became the representative for Fox Hill in 1987, he remembered how people used to think that Fox Hill was behind God's back. He said they used to call Fox Hill people sapodilly eaters. He determined that his role was to enhance the physical appearance and image of Fox Hill, and in the words of the article, to rekindle a sense of civic pride among its residents. In that, I would say he succeeded. Thus, the modern incarnation of what you see today in Fox Hill is very much the creation of George Mackey. He set about rehabilitating the village center and the school's premises and the post office and its environs. He also brought the National Insurance Board here and allied services for telephone and electricity. He thought that Fox Hill could become a second town center, and so he arranged the Fox Hill Parade in its present configuration with the help of the Fox Hill Community Development Association. Fox Hill has therefore been a village and an area for a long time in the social development of the Bahamas. In the constituency boundary changes which came into force prior to the general election of the 10th of April 1968, Fox Hill became a political constituency for the first time. The first representative then, in the truest sense of the word, for Fox Hill was the late Lionel Davis. Today, the Fox Hill constituency does not encompass all of the village of Fox Hill. For example, Congo Town falls outside the environs and its boundaries. It is my hope, Prime Minister, that in the next general election there will be an adjustment so that the constituency of Fox Hill can accurately reflect the village of Fox Hill. It is clear that our political ancestors made a decision 45 years ago to honor the history and uniqueness of the Fox Hill people by creating a constituency named in their honor, and to give them a representative that would protect their rich cultural heritage. We, in this generation, must not fail them. Lionel Davis is remembered for reviving the spirit of the Fox Hill celebrations by appearing on the days of emancipation in African dress. Maurice Tynes, the now chair of the Fox Hill Festival, recalls that it was he, Lionel Davis, who returned the climbing of the greasy pole to the festival. Mr. Davis was succeeded by Mr. Frank Edgecombe in 1977. Mr. Edgecombe was a former principal of the Sandlands All-Age School and a member of this church. He served until 1987, when he was succeeded by the late George Mackey. And he was followed by Johnny Ann Dorset, who was the granddaughter of Josiah Ramming, J.P., which is a point of digression. The Bahamas Handbook records the following about Josiah Ramming, and I quote, "Tales abound of some of the more colorful characters of the village's past. One of the most well-known is Josiah Ramming, who claimed to be the grandson of an African prince. The highly respected Justice of the Peace was a successful farmer of vegetables and citrus on the property known as Sugar Hill. He also dabbled extensively in real estate. Baptist from birth, he became a superintendent of the Sunday school, then caused quite a scandal when he converted to Roman Catholicism in the 1930s. End of quote. Well, I don't know if scandal is the right word, and I'm only quoting there. So she probably meant it caused quite a stir. What we know is that Mr. Ramming gave many of his children over to the Roman Catholic Church because several of his daughters became Roman Catholic nuns at the St. Martin's Convent in Nassau. And one daughter, Alice, I don't know if she's here tonight, continues to be a Baptist and continues to attend the services here at Mount Carey, even though her father left and became a Roman Catholic. Another daughter, the late Margaret Demetrius, donated a senior citizens home in the community, which now bears her name just to the north of this church. And of course we know that Josiah the JP has found its way into the musical law of the country when Ronnie Butler sang Going Down Burma Road, and he began it with the ditty, Don't Mind Livingston, Josiah the JP, in which one supposes the people were saying, as Livingston was in fact a son of Josiah, don't mind or pay any attention to Livingston because Josiah is the Justice of the Peace. Johnny Ann Dorset, Josiah's granddaughter, was succeeded as MP for Fox Hill by me, and I serve to this day. I return to where I began. I serve knowing that there is this rich history and heritage that I have to protect. A history which pays tribute to Pa Bay, to whom reference is also made in the Bahamas Handbook. His proper name, the handbook says, was Zacharias Adderley, and people thought that he knew Obia, says the handbook. It quotes from the book by Foxhillian Gladys Manuel in her historical notes on the Fox Hill community, and quoting from Mrs. Manuel. Pa Bay admitted to a belief in certain mystical forces, and people came from far and wide to watch his attempts and incarnations, and to buy his many varied concoctions. But it is interesting to note that his patrons came from outside the village. The villagers either did not need him or they knew his limitations only too well. End of quote. I pledge to return to the role of women in the history of Fox Hill. So much of the history is always told from the male perspective, but you can be sure that it could not have been done without the women. So here is how the Reverend Dr. Philip Ramming, in the notes from my research in Marche Mackey, recalls the women of Fox Hill, and I quote, "Before the ladies of Fox Hill moved to the selling of their products in the downtown square, the ladies of Fox Hill began by selling their crafts at the Fort Montague Hotel. Women like Melissa Davis, wife of the former pastor of Mount Carey Baptist, Eunice Demerit, the Jarrett sisters, Myrnette Davis, and Beryl Wright. As they began to move farther to Rawson Square due to the fact that it was harder for tourists to travel to the Fort Montague Hotel, the women of Fox Hill began taking their craft to the square. Also, women like Elizabeth Sinclair, the owner of the property on which the National Insurance Building is located, the Mortimers, the owners of the property where the Urban Renewal Office is located. Also, Thomas Mortimer was assisted by Miss Sinclair. The Mortimers also owned a shop at the Red Light at Blanco Bleach across from Boys Industrial School. Nora Davis, her husband was Leonard Davis, whose grandson is an attorney and now owns Fox Hill's Jungle Club. Ena Davis, the daughter, is still working in the straw industry today. Rebecca Ramming, who's the mother of Dr. Ramming, was also a straw vendor, and as a young person, he can recall her sewing raffia. When it came to the organization of the voice of the people in the straw industry, Ms. Bertha Brown, mother-in-law of Sir Orville Turnquest, established the group which became that voice, and the women of Fox Hill played an important part in this group. These women of Fox Hill were strong, dedicated women, but they lacked those organizational skills, and that is where Ms. Brown came in. She offered that voice and built an organization. The ladies who made it to the square represented the ladies who could not make it that far. So the women who stayed would send their work with the one who went to the square. And when those ladies returned, they would give the ladies their cut from the sales. When the ladies went to the market, the ladies and the community at large worked to ensure that there was craft to go to market the following day. It was all about the hard work so that they can make money during this difficult period." End of quote. Today, we still have women from Fox Hill who are in the straw market. But women are now in leadership positions in the village, and indeed, one of them has already served, as I said, as a member of Parliament, Mrs. Johnny Ann Dorset. Reverend Julia Bain, for example, is now the head of the Church of God at Bernard Road. And Reverend Sherelle Saunders heads the Church of God Faith Mission, something that would not have been possible 100 or even 50 years ago. But with the embracing of education and the opening up of horizons, it is natural for women to continue to take the lead in our communities. And in business, I think of Mrs. Essie Ferguson, who has customers lining up for her special brand of fried chicken. Today in Fox Hill, in 2013, Fox Hill is at the end of a continuum, built on a history of struggle and toil. It is at the forefront of the struggle of the maintenance of the African identity in the Bahamas. Why is it, I wonder, that this community, forged as it was by an accident of history, has ended up being the intellectual center of the African movement in our country? This is a matter which deserves more study and support. Fox Hill has changed with the coming of the new subdivisions and the people from over town, as the outsiders are called by Fox Hillians. The newcomers must know the history. The story that I have told tonight is about the people that we call Bahamians. The more problematic entrants are the Haitian migrants who have settled in low-cost rental units throughout the area. Their children make up almost a third of the Sandlands Primary School, and if they're going to continue to be part of the unfolding story of Fox Hill, will they be told the story so that the story becomes their story? That is an issue which only Fox Hillians and their government can settle over time. In a sense, inward migration is not new, because migration from other islands into Fox Hill has been continuous over the past 2 centuries, from Eleuthera and from Exuma in particular. This new group, of course, is French speakers, and this presents new issues and a new ethos with which we have to deal. The late Rex Nettleford used to describe our societies as being the rhythm of Africa with the melody of Europe. And while some say that Professor Nettleford's expression is simplistic, what it pithily describes is the interactions between the dominant culture of Europe and the subsumed and supposed inferior culture of Africa. What we know from that expression, though, is that the music is not complete without both parts. People, try as they might to suppress the African presence, it just keeps on coming. And Fox Hill has led the way in maintaining its presence. It infuses our music, our art, and our very lives. We are African, and Fox Hill each year at Emancipation Day reminds us of that fact. Each year at this time, the eyes of the country are on Fox Hill. This year, in our 40th year as a country, we look particularly at the role which Fox Hill played in who we are today. It reminds us of the African ethos of our origins. We came here by accident, against our wills, but we have forged a magnificent future while we have occupied these rocks. The Governor General, Sir Arthur Folkes, said in a recent interview that we are 40 years as an independent country, but we were a country before 1973. Tonight, we have lived through some of the events which make that statement of the Governor General more self-evident. We were here before 1973, and with God's help, we shall endure long after these 40 years. The question is, what will our children do? The future is surely theirs. Whether we like it or not, we pass it off to them. I am confident that they are smarter than us, better educated than us, that whatever vision they have for this country, they will protect all the things about which we have spoken here tonight. We are speaking about the dignity of man, that no man or woman shall ever be again a slave, that the resources of this country belong to all Bahamians of whatever hue and description. George Mackey recalled a talk which two of the heroes of his generation gave to him at the government high school when he was a student there. One of them was the late A.F. Adderley, and another was the late Leon Walton Young, who was from Fox Hill and served in the House of Assembly, and after whom the L.W. Young School is named. Now, George said that Mr. Adderley started first, and he told them, school, so that you can contribute to the greater good and do good for your nation. But while he heard and appreciated what Mr. Adderley was saying, they should actually go to school, learn their assembly from 1912 42. Dr. Cleveland Eneas, writing in his book Baintown, remembers Mr. Young this way, and I quote, "Whenever Mr. Young came to Baintown, he came in the Buick, and we were able to spot it parked in front of my grandfather's house, which stands immediately west of Wesley's schoolroom on Meadow Street. It was a fast race up Meadow Street by us boys whenever we saw his Buick coming, and we would stand around it for a long time as he was visiting, looking and touching and gaping and eyeing. When he was ready to leave, my brother and I always had the privilege of riding the running boards while he cruised slowly down the street to our house. Our friends ran all the way along the side. That was always a big event for our day. Mr. Young was a great Bahamian who in his time helped to shape the country to become what it is today. Beside the school in Congotown, Young Street is named for him, and one day there might still be a monument standing to him somewhere to his memory. To me, he was a Yoruba who was not ashamed of his ancestry and helped to stimulate my early interest in the subject." End of quote. When Leon Walton Young died in Nassau, the Nassau Guardian described his funeral as the largest one that had ever taken place in Fox Hill. When the late George Mackey died, and I was then the representative, and we were planning his funeral, I wanted to plan and execute a funeral that would rival the size of Leon Walton Young's for the contribution which George made to the modern development of Fox Hill. Tomorrow, we will honor another Prince of Africa by renaming the street on which he lives Frank Edgecombe Street, and I hope you will be able to join us tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. out in front of his home as the Prime Minister returns to Fox Hill for the renaming of the street. The younger generation, they get it too. And in this connection, I want to recall a man named Andre Pratt. He is one of the men who climbs the greasy pole every year. Just did so on Monday, will do so again on Tuesday. If you see him, you are immediately reminded of a Maasai warrior, tall and wiry and strong. Each year, he is one of the men who climbs the greasy pole, as I said. So one summer day, I was in my car turning up the hill from the Eastern Road into Fox Hill. He and a group of his contemporaries were out selling ganapes, as is the custom when the summertime comes. So I stopped and I rolled down the window, and he came and handed me a pack of ganapes. I reached in my pocket. He shook his head and his hand and said, "No, sir, that's okay." And I said, "But you're giving away the profits." And he said, "That's okay. Our ancestors left this for us." And I said, "Amen, brother." Amen. They did indeed. And I'm reminded of the day when I first came to Fox Hill back in 1997, and Don Bryce and Johnny Bullard took me rambling through the bush off Step Street to see the Blue Hole on the other side of Step Street. It was like, when you went and saw that Blue Hole, it was like you had reached a place of pure magic. So, tonight, my friends, brothers and sisters, all, Prime Minister, compare and contrast the view of George Mackey that people used to say Fox Hill was being behind God's back. The false story of getting the news of emancipation 1 week later that used to infuriate Eric Wilmot when he heard it. George says Fox Hillians used to be called sappadilly eaters. Compare that to today, where Fox Hill is the repository and protector, the center of the country's African culture. Who would have thought it? And the old people say, ain't God a good God? So, after all of this, is there any wonder that the songwriter Eric Mins writes the following? I want a Fox Hill gal every time I get lonely. I want a Fox Hill gal every time I sing. I want to lose my heart to a girl from the eastern part. When I get married, she's the one who can wear my ring. Thank you. God bless you, and good night. God bless the Commonwealth of the Bahamas.
We'll now have a selection from the Mount Carey Union Baptist Church Choir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. To my colleagues here present, to the pastor of this church, Reverend Anderson, to all of the distinguished Foxillians who are here, to colleagues in the National Independence Secretariat, Ms. Tracy Thompson, or Dr. Tracy Thompson, I see here the co-chair, who is the daughter of Jeffrey Thompson, one of the freedom fighters of our country, and who holds the chair in oral history in the College of the Bahamas. This would be an interesting evening for you. To Mrs. Arlene Nash, a former principal at St. John's College and now a consultant with the Ministry of Tourism. To the young lady who I walked up this aisle with Fred Mitchell and when she was getting married and giving her away. And so my participation in a Foxhill marriage, the striking thing I want to say to you is this, that in coming up here year after year after year, and usually going from church to church, and listening to the children, and trying to imagine going back 100 years or 50 years, what it was like, and listening to women in particular who were there 30 and 40 years ago, coming up and reciting what they did as a child. And I said to myself, and I said, look, we got to do something about this, because you had Adelaide, you had Gambia, and you had Foxhill. And only Foxhill is carrying on this tradition in a very real and meaningful way. And so I challenged Fred. I said, we come up here on Foxhill Day, we make the similar speech about how wonderful it is to how people in this part of the Bahamas celebrate a journey that was so enriching to our country. But I'm frightened that it's going to die out. I'm frightened that the people, primarily the churches who are led to cause this to happen, one day will have different leaders. And those leaders wouldn't have the same kind of interest and the same kind of understanding of why it's so important to keep on passing the journey on from generation to generation. And Fred Mitchell said why it is so important to know who we are, how we got where we got. And then I looked at this painting, and I'm told by one of our extraordinary artists of African experiences, Max Taylor. And I said to myself, if you keep on looking at it, it depicts a time that is a historic time in the country when the slaves were freed. And look at the manacles on the man who is supposed to be the strong man, but who's had his chains broken as an expression of freedom. Look at the woman and the expectation. The wife, the soulmate, the sister. But look at the expression he captures. And then I concluded. Jack Thompson, Tracy Thompson, I concluded that we have to commission paintings by capturing and having our artists look back, capturing the journey we have made, because those paintings last forever and forever. And when you come into a church like Mount Carey, and Fred Mitchell says, is it 14? He's the 14th pastor. And I've come up here at a time when Enoch Backwood was here, and for what I know, the one before, because we kept on coming. I measure myself by who was a little boy and a little girl in the audience, and I watched them grow up into bigger and bigger and bigger until they could talk to me almost as equals. And I have a way of saying to the mothers, child, you got now a child in my set. That's how I tell them they're old and not I. But it's been a wonderful, enriching time. And I want to say to those of you who have had sufficient interest to come up here for this occasion, that there is a real good feeling about being taken back in our past. We have the gift of imagination. And just for this moment, to think back of the Bahamas when people weren't free. And to look at the program you have and see the note here, in 1884, the first men of color to be elected. Conrad Duncombe, George Anderson. Reverend Anderson, I don't know if you claim in part of that. Henry Umbrister replaced Duncombe. Henry Adley, right down to Fred Mitchell. And so, for me, this was a wonderful evening. Really, again, setting out steps for us that I quote all the time when I speak. When I say that, well, it was to the effect, unless we tell our story, we run the risk of others telling it for us, and therefore the errors that will be made that would not accurately reflect our story. And I says, until lions, it's an old African proverb, until lions have their own authors, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And it's a powerful reminder that we must cause the historians in our midst to capture the stories of great Bahamians which make up the stories of the Bahamas, which makes up the history of the Bahamas. And to recognize that if we have failed, that's where we have failed. Because today in the Bahamas, our young people do not know even the leaders who took our country into majority rule and independence. And I look to the time when someone will say, "Who you say Perry Christie was?" That's the fear I have, not so much about who I was, because he didn't talk much about the Jungle Valley, but you know, that's for people like you to write about. Finally, let me say that I was happy that Brave Davis is here, who comes from an island that is legendary in our history for its culture and capturing its culture. We have around the table, there's a story of a great Cat Islander slave who understood that he had to fight for freedom and came to New Providence, and they called him Black Dick. And so this is my Black Dick. That's how we tease him. That was his name. You know, like how Malcolm X, that's all he was. And the woman, poor Black Kate in Crooked Island, she was poor Black Kate. But her story was a story that caused the first people to be charged for cruelty against slaves, because she was put in the stockade where they put your head and make you stand up and put poison, put them out pepper in your eyes to keep you awake. And she was defiant, and she died as a young teenager. And the abolitionists in England used her story to fight for the abolition of slavery. We don't know the story of those people in our past who struck a blow for freedom. And we have to have those stories told over and over, so that history becomes a part of us. And so to those who have contributed so much to our country, and tomorrow we will try our best to honor one of them who's not well, Frank Edgefield. To be able to, in honoring him, to remember George Mackey, who died too soon. And in honoring him, to remember Juanita and Jacinta, and those were young people, and Fred, but Lionel Davis. And God graced me with the opportunity to be around for all of these men who've done so much to lift our spirits and to cause us to feel proud of who we are. Fred Mitchell is carrying on that tradition. And I smile all the time when he says, I'm not a Foxillian by birth, but I've been made one in practice by my commitment, my spirit, and all that I have done to engender and sustain. So I want to end, Fred, by thanking you. You're an excellent writer. I expect that to be in a pamphlet in short order. I expect that pamphlet to go to the churches for distribution in the churches, to go into the schools for distribution in the schools. I expect it, like your document on majority rule, to be distributed. And I would expect examination questions to be asked on it. So that a generation of Bahamians, unlike my generation who knew about Sir Francis Drake, who circumnavigated the world in English books, and Sir John Hawkins, I had to pass O-levels, calling their names, Vasco da Gama and the rest of them. But that they would be able to know, and, the only thing Fred didn't do tonight was dance. Because I know you can't dance, but look here. And you become very dangerous when you start talking about Fox Hill Gal. But Fred, I just wanted to end by saying that today in Parliament, I indicated how life is moving on and how there's a defined time to live, and how for someone like myself, who's next year will be my 40th year in public life, and in this term I started in the Senate, and so next year will mark 40 years between the Senate and the House of Assembly consecutively, and how that by any stretch of the imagination I'm in the twilight of my life, and not just my political life, and that for me to be able to have an opportunity to be present here with you, and to see in our 40th year of independence that we've made an effort to remind you of who you are, and to say to the younger, more qualified ones who are amongst us that you have an obligation to write about yourself, to be creative, bring forth all your talents and the gifts that God has given you. Become the artists, the painters, the songwriters, the singers, the actors, the actresses, the neurosurgeons, the scientists. Today, in the context of the Bahamas, we passed stem cell legislation, where Bahamians now today travel all over the world looking for some way of helping them with some disease they or their children have. And where the question came up as to whether at this time we should be doing something like that. And I told them, as I told my cabinet, I have a friend called Gus Cooper. And I went to a hospital in the United States of America to see him when they told me he'd lost the will to live. A man who, a few weeks ago, I walked into a hospital when he was preparing for surgery. He walked in and was sitting there talking to me, and to see what happened to him after surgery, and see the challenge as to whether or not he should live. And for me to be able to say to him, my brother, when I was down, you refused to allow me to give up and to give in. You have the greatest challenge in your life. But you are my leader as a Valley boy. You had the God-given gifts to lead hundreds of us and to inspire hundreds of us to believe that we could do it. I'm not going to allow you to sit over here and give up. You didn't allow me to do it. And I said, even if you have to come to Bay Street in a wheelchair, you're coming as the leader of the Valley Boys. Even if you are paralyzed and you can't talk as it is now, you come and you point with one hand that you could use. But as long as God has given you this breath in your body, we are going to give you, through our support, the will to live. Because that's what you represent to so many of us throughout this country. Fred, that's what we're talking about here in Fox Hill tonight. That those people who struck a blow for freedom over the centuries, and they anonymously, who took a stand, who in given circumstances in this village, who said, I'm tired, there should be change. That's what you were talking about. And that's what progress is all about. And I just say that that's why I've come up here, having been on my feet practically all day talking, to listen to Fred tonight. You fulfilled the obligation I placed on you. You've done so magnificently. And I hope and it is my hope that we join you in ensuring the widest possible distribution of the lecture, and that Fox Hill will use this occasion to each year have a Foxhillian come up and make some presentation, serious presentation, on the customs and the cultural expressions and the paintings, whatever it is. And if God graces me with the life, I will be here to join you and share that occasion with you, because it is so important to the ethos of our country, and by that I mean to that characteristic spirit, that Christian spirit that joins us together as Bahamians, one to the other, regardless of the politics or other divisions, the church, other divisions we may have. But that spirit that infuses in us this indomitable spirit that if you get knocked down, you're a Bahamian, you'll get back up.
Ladies and gentlemen, remain standing as we put our hands together and thank our Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Perry Gladstone Christie, for seeing the wisdom to commission this event tonight And secondly, to our Member of Parliament, the Honourable Frederick Mitchell, who did an excellent job in imparting the history of Fox Hill to us this evening. Thank you so much. Now coming with the vote of thanks is our very own Miss Olive Mackey, followed by the benediction by Reverend Warren Anderson.
Here am I again. To our Prime Minister, the Honourable Perry Christie, and all of our cabinet ministers, to our great Member of Parliament who did such a magnificent job in the history of Fox Hill. And yes, Mr. Mitchell, you are indeed a Foxillian. You can be none other but a Foxillian. On behalf of our chairman, Mr. Maurice Steins, who is the chairperson of the Fox Hill Festival Committee, you would have heard that he lost his mom, so we ask that you keep he and his family in prayer as they go through this hour of bereavement. I am standing in the gap for him, extending our vote of thanks to each and every one of you. We indeed happy to acknowledge the many persons, the National Independence Commission, Dr. Jacinta Higgs, Reverend Dr. Philip Ramming, Gladys Manuel, Dr. Gail Saunders, Reverend Dr. J. Carl Ramming, the people of St. Mark's, Macedonia, St. Paul, St. Anselm's, St. Anne's, Coke Methodist Church, Head of Archives, all media houses, Broadcasting Corporation of the Bahamas, Pastor Reverend Warren Anderson and the fine people here at Mount Carey, our choir, who we had to sing again because Mr. Mitchell said you have to sing that song again for us. To our MC, our member, Miss Tammy Ferguson Culmer, we say thank you. And if anyone's name I've left out, please don't charge it to me. You are loved. If it was not for you, we would not have had this lecture. So we indeed happy that you have come. And Mr. Devante Roll, who is up there working extremely hard, we say thank you. And to all of you who have sat by your bedside and watched us, we say thank you, thank you, thank you. And to the handsome young man who sang the national anthem, his voice is as beautiful, Mr. Culmer, we say thank you. We indeed enjoyed it. And once again, feel free, and I've noticed that there will be refreshment, but just don't wait to come to Mount Carey on a special occasion. Anytime, just come. Especially on Tuesday, come and enjoy Fox Hill Day with us. May God continue to bless you, guide, and keep you. Thanks again.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed learning more about the rich benediction. After the benediction.
Thank you, God, for the day that you've given to us. Now unto him who is able to keep us from falling. The only wise God be power and dominion. Forever and ever we pray. Amen. Amen.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed learning more about the rich history of Fox Hill, and indeed are inspired to preserve and continue the Bahamian story. We also hope that you've enjoyed our broadcast from Mount Carey Union Baptist Church. On behalf of the entire ZNS production team, I'm Julian Reed. Good night.
history, development, and impact of Foxhill on the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, presented by the Honourable Fred Mitchell, Member of Parliament and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration.